Freedom is of the utmost importance today because our freedoms have been taken away due to the current situation we find ourselves in. But what is freedom? And what I want to explain today is what freedom is and also why nobody actually wants you to be free. Freedom can be explained in many ways, but the simplest way to explain freedom is the release from bondage. So this liberation from being bound or from bondage, right? So it's kind of like escaping a prison, and we are free from the constraints that we once had previously. Now, this idea of freedom can be applied to all levels of life. Now, the situation we find ourselves in now is we have, governments, media, other organizations and corporations who are trying to keep our freedoms away and have these restrictions in place for all of us. Now, let me clarify. The government, the media, and even people themselves don't want you to be free. Actually, nobody wants you to be free in the truest sense. From a very superficial sense, we can understand this, right? The government and media and other corporations have a vested interest in taking our freedoms away. It's always been like that between the masses and the governments have always increasingly took our freedoms away as we've evolved as a society. And so that's all very well known. And that is up to the masses to reclaim their freedom on that level. Now, that level of freedom is, the freedom of autonomy, the freedom to move about freely, the freedom to choose what is right for you, freedom of speech, which is being destroyed in countries such as America. And so that is kind of what freedom is, right? It's this release from this bondage of an overarching sort of authority that is trying to dictate to you how you should live your life, or in the sense of freedom of speech, cancelling you so to censor you from your own thoughts and your own beliefs, as if we all haven't thought differently since the dawn of time. Newsflash, everyone has always thought differently, and we all do think differently, but just because we have social media these days, everyone is kind of surprised that, wow, we all think differently. Why don't we think the same? It's kind of immature, isn't it? We always have thought differently. Different cultures have different psychological structures. This is all very well known if you understand cognitive science and also spirituality. Now, why I said nobody wants you to be free, it's not just about the freedom of autonomy. It's about liberation itself, the ideal of spiritual liberation in Eastern spirituality. This is ultimate freedom, right? This is total freedom, as Judah Krishnamurti would put it. And so most people don't want this type of freedom for you. People, government, media, corporations, what have you, do not want this type of freedom for you because you are completely free. You won't continue to feed the beast, so to speak, the corporate machine, and you'll be indifferent to society somewhat because you have completely dissolved your sense of self. So from a spiritual perspective, freedom is the liberation from the bondage of your identity. So your identity is like a prison, right? It is all the beliefs, the concepts, even the way that you see the world and your upbringing, your conditioning, which keeps you in this prison that we would call the identity, which actually obscures your vision of seeing reality as it truly is. You don't see reality as it truly is because you superimpose your beliefs, your concepts, your way of thinking and worldview onto a world that is just natural and nature. But you superimpose your subjective view on the world. And so this kind of keeps you in a prison. And this is why you are not free, ultimately. Even if we had freedom to move about and freedom of speech and everything, which I do support, obviously. But even if we have all of that, we are still bound by the prison of our identity. And so it's hard for us then to see the world as it truly is, because we tend to see the world as we like to see it, through our likes and our dislikes according to our subjective view of the world based on our conditioning and our identity. So what is the primary focus in Eastern spirituality is the dissolution of this identity, the disintegration of the conditioning that we have had. Now, the amazing thing is once you start to dissolve this identity, you start to feel this freedom because you have a sense of unity then, a sense of oneness. as you begin to peel these layers back, the freedom becomes an awakening into oneness, which is similar to the freedom from government tyranny. Because once you have the freedom from government tyranny, you don't then live with the stress and anxiety of this overarching authority figure imposing over you. And you feel, free, and you can move about as you please, and so forth and so on. Same with spiritual freedom, because it's an awakening into the oneness of reality, which is actually the truth of reality. Everything is ultimately one. There's only one substratum, one Brahman, one Tao. And we are a localization of that one consciousness expressing itself. But we identify with the equipment, the body, the mind, the identity, which then distorts our vision of oneness, which then imprisons us in this identity that we believe we are. And so we are not free. But once we begin to dissolve that, then we begin to see reality as it truly is. And it's pure one unified state of consciousness. And so that is what happens when you begin to engage in deeper spiritual work. So when people say, can you be free in this life? From a spiritual perspective, they're talking about, can you be liberated from the identity? And I can tell you, yes, you can. Many before us have achieved that. And so we've had many gurus and sages and spiritual masters who have become free from the prison of their identity to see the world in its true one nature. Now, the reason why I originally said nobody wants you to be free is because once you are free, then you are, in some sense, indifferent to the world. And their perception of you is distorted. And their perception of you is now confused because they once had a perspective of you as this person. But once you've begun to dissolve that person, then you begin to be more peaceful, more silent. You listen more, you're more compassionate, you're more forgiving. You are exactly what the world needs, but doesn't know it needs it. And so that's what you become. And so you become indifferent to the masses in some sense because you are free from your identity. While everyone else is going around in conflict with identity versus identity or groupthink versus groupthink, and you are free of all of that. You have become completely liberated from that. This is why some people say that someone who is completely free, they can be in a prison, but they are still completely free within. Even though the circumstances in the external world are not good and not favorable for the freedom of autonomy, they are completely free within, and so nothing can bind them. So nobody really wants you to be free, truly. So it's no surprises that the government, the media, other corporations don't want you to be free either, because they don't have any more power over you. And if we turn that within ourselves, our ego doesn't want us to be free either because it starts to lose its power over us. We are fundamentally the Atman, which is Brahman, which is the ultimate substratum of the ultimate reality. And so our ego does not want that. The ego believes it actually really exists, and it believes in this world of duality and in the upkeep of its accumulative sense of self. And so it will do anything and everything to enhance its survival. But this is where spiritual work comes into it. Once you begin to do spiritual work on a deeper level through spiritual practices and inquiry, then that ego begins to disintegrate and dissolve. And then your consciousness then begins to expand, and you begin to have a greater perception of the actual oneness of reality. But you can't see that through your ego. Your ego is a distortion. It's like, again, the Pink Floyd cover where the one pure white light is going through the prism and then it is reflected in the 7 colors. The 7 colors is what our ego is. It's a distortion of reality. But all that really exists is a pure white light. And so freedom on all levels are important. There is no doubt about that. Everyone should be free to move about freely, to have freedom of speech, to ultimately have spiritual freedom, where you cannot be imprisoned by anything in the external world. But you should not listen to those who will always try and drag you down and bring you back into the egoic world. That's what a lot of spiritual aspirants find. Once they begin to be free, other people, say friends or family, usually will try to bring them back down to earth, so to speak, even though they are now really grounded on earth, but they try to bring them back down to the egoic earth, we should say, to engage in the illusion with them, to engage in this hypnosis of the ego, to engage in this collective hypnosis of the ego. But you are free from that. But you need to remember and always keep it in mind, when you are evolving in your spiritual practice, when you are developing the mind, you will encounter people who will try to drag you down. And it's only because nobody wants you to be free. And the ego especially doesn't want you to be free because the ego itself is the prison. And so we have other prisons trying to pull us back into the prison, but you have knocked down the walls and you walk free into the beauty of oneness in the universe. And so that's what I want to share with you today. Freedom on all levels are important. And when you engage in spiritual work, never let anybody drag you back down into the world of ego. And you can be liberated in this life, but you can't let anyone hold you back from that ultimate liberation. You have to make a choice. And that choice is, do you want to truly be free in this life? Shanti, shanti, shanti.